Hey there. Welcome back. Hope you're all doing well. We're going to go ahead and continue reading. Remember, you can always email me with any questions you have on any of the assignments, which you guys are all doing pretty well right now. So just keep sticking with me. This is a good, interesting read. So, coal miners and steelworkers' efforts produced war materials like these 3-inch shells at a Bethlehem Steel Company factory. To free up men to fight the war, women were trained to manufacture um, munitions. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, 1918. So, this is a lot of the men worked in these factories to make ammo and weapons and things for the army. And then when the war started, the First World War, a lot of the men had to go and fight. So their wives and daughters and mothers, a lot of them stayed behind and then had to learn how to do their jobs so that they could continue to produce the things they needed to fight in the war. Also, some men were able to kind of count this as serving their country. They were providing all the weapons and things, so they didn't have to go to war. They were able to work from home, but still continue to provide for the soldiers in the army. The war ended in November 1918, and soon after, the mine operators nixed their end of the contract, in which they had recognized the United Mine Workers Union. Miners in western Pennsylvania lost what little leverage they had gained, and any hope of a new pay increase to cover the spike in prices over the last few years. By the following summer, Fannie had committed the full force of her personality to buck up the UMWA in Black Valley. In late July 1919, miners walked out of Allegheny Coal and Coke in Pennsylvania, demanding the company recognize the union. Strikers picketed on public roads near the mine. Their sheriffs swore in extra deputies, passed out rifles, and sent the men to patrol company boundaries. These were not impartial law enforcement officers. They were thugs and riffraff, deputized at the whim of industrial corporations in the valley. So, what happened after the war was we're going to pause on reading here for a second. The extra pay went away and all of that. So then they decided that, you know what, war's over. We're no longer going to recognize this union. We're going to go back to kind of doing the same thing we've been doing. They fought and they went on strike again. And then the sheriff, who remember is on like the mine owners' side, they're against the unions. They just started calling in anybody, like riffraff, they say, or thugs off the streets. And they're like, hey, we're going to make you police officers here, and you're going to help us control these strikers. So back to reading. A tense peace lasted 5 weeks until an argument broke out between deputies and striking coal miners. On the afternoon of August 6th, Fannie arrived in the neighborhood of Abe Roth's grocery shop in Natrona, just a short walk from the mine entrance in Breckenridge. She hoped to convince miners coming off shift to join the strike. The grocery store was where women gathered to socialize, and children came along hoping for a few pennies for a treat. That muggy summer afternoon, the strikers and deputies exchanged insults, sparking gunfire along the route from the store to the mine. A woman in the crowd suggested that the miners arm themselves for protection. Fannie disagreed. We don't want our people carrying, she said. 7-year-old Stanley Afrafalco noticed the commotion as he left Abe Roth's store with cigarettes for his father and ran to watch. He saw deputies fire their handguns, and between shots, one of them beat retired miner Joseph Starzelski with a club. So they beat this miner who was retired with a club. For God's sake, don't kill him, Fanny shouted, but they ignored her. One of the deputies aimed at Starzelski and fired 5 shots into his back. The man came out of nearby Allegheny Coal and Coke first aid shack, carrying an armload of rifles. The man handed them out to the officers as Fanny continued to rebuke them. One of the deputies aimed a kick at Fanny, and she jumped back, falling to one knee. She struggled toward safety behind the Rafalco family's backyard fence, hurting children with her, but the deputy pursued her, swinging his club and hitting Fanny in the head. Then more officers turned on her and fired, hammering her to the ground. So this is our kind of flashback, right? At the beginning of this story, it talked to us a little bit about this, and it said that Fannie was kind of shot to the ground, right, at the Rafalcos. So this is where this is happening. So she was very adamant that they continue to be unarmed and they continue to not use force on these people. But the deputies came out and they pursued her, and they shot the one retired mine worker 5 times in the back, and then they kicked her. She struggled to the ground, got up, and then tried to get the kids safely away. And then they followed her, and then they fired at her. So we'll see what happens here next. 2 of the sheriff's deputies at the scene of Fannie's death, according to eyewitness Deputy John Pearson, left, fired the shots that killed Sellens, which is Fannie, Breckenridge, Pennsylvania, August 1919. At the scene where Fannie was shot, 9 bullets struck the fence and the gate. So you can see this fence. The deputies moved on to attack another worker, not noticing Stanley. His parents and grandpap were calling for him in Polish, but he ignored them. "I was just a curious kid," he said later. Stanley ran to Fannie. Despite the blows to her head, Fannie's straw hat remained pinned to her head. Stanley lifted the brim and saw that she was dead. Shocked, he ran away, but continued to watch from a distance. The sheriff's officers dragged the bodies to a car, Fannie by her feet, and Joseph Starzelski by his collar, and stacked them into the trunk to haul them away. That night, the justice of the peace charged 10 deputies with murder, but the local sheriff's department did not arrest them. Autopsies showed Fannie died of a crushed skull and suffered 3 gunshots to the side of the head and 1 to her back. 5 point-blank gunshots killed Starzelski. 7 other men were shot but survived. 3 days after Fannie's death, grieving people lined the streets before dawn, waiting for her casket to pass by. Mourners crowded into the little wooden church in New Kensington, where Fannie had lived, a few miles downriver from Natrona. In the largest funeral procession in the town's history, thousands paid their respects as Fannie and Starzelski's bodies were borne from St. Peter's Catholic Church and the Union Cemetery. So this is the newspaper article. The New York Times reported on the trial of the 3 men indicted in Fannie Sellens' death. The United Mine Workers of America petitioned for a special prosecutor in an effort to ensure an unbiased prosecution. Say slain woman led mob. Steel deputies testify organizer-headed attack on them. Pittsburgh, June 7th. Mrs. Fannie Sellens, organizer for the Union Mine Workers, was leading a charging mob of men and women armed with clubs and bricks when she was killed by a volley of shots by guards at the plant of Allegheny Steel Company. According to defense witnesses today, the trial of Edward Manison and D.J. Riley, deputy sheriffs, charged with the murder of the woman union leader. State witness had previously testified that there was no disorder at the mine until after the deputies fired into the crowd. R.J. Schrant, a deputy, testified that a small group of men had been driven back. Mrs. Sellens organized a mob and led the charge against the line of deputies. Shots were fired from nearby houses, he said, but the guards used their riot sticks until they were broken. Then firing began, and when the crowd was dispersed, Mrs. Sellens and Philip Strzynski, a miner, lay dead in the roadway. 3 men who say they had been wounded by the deputies' fire testified that there had been no attack on the officers and that there was no occasion for shooting. So you can see here, it sounds like 2 very different stories being told. These women were among the thousands of mourners who attended Fannie Sellens' funeral in St. Peter's Church, the largest such service in the history of New Kensington, Pennsylvania, August 29, 1919. This is the coroner's jury verdict. Found that Fannie Sellens died from a gunshot wound to the left temple. The document also commended the local sheriff for his prompt and successful action to protect property and persons in the vicinity, for his judgment in selecting deputies. So they were praised for taking out Fannie because they felt like she was creating too much of a ruckus. A month later, the Allegheny County coroner's jury convened in Pittsburgh to examine the evidence. The officer who shot Fannie insisted she was leading a riot and that Union sympathizers had acted with them with rocks and sticks. The press reported that Fannie Sellens was killed while on picket duty. The jury disregarded the testimony of some 60 eyewitnesses who gave sworn statements that the attack by deputies was unprovoked. So they had 60 people saying, this is how it happened, and they dismissed all of that, saying they didn't listen to that. The jury decided the killings of Fannie and Joseph were justifiable homicides, saying there were no innocent bystanders and everyone in the crowd was guilty of rioting. The crowd of people who witnessed Fannie's death believed she was shot down in cold blood. UMWA leaders fired off telegraphs of President Wilson, demanding a federal investigation. One of the deputies accused of shooting Fannie had been heard earlier threatening to get her. After the shooting, another was heard saying that Fannie Sellens had finally gotten what she deserved. The Federal Department of Labor investigation languished amid prevailing American fears that labor unions harbored communists. Since the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, steel companies had incited this xenophobia and painted strikers as wanting to overthrow the government. This prejudice figured strongly in the attitude of the coroner's jury that saw union families as a mob of rioters and ruled that the deputies killed Fannie in self-defense. Under the pressure from Fannie's family and the UMWA, a grand jury was called to hear the evidence. In 1923, 3 deputies were indicted for murder, and the case went to trial. One of them, the deputy who eyewitnesses claimed shot and killed Fannie, had disappeared. The other 2 were acquitted of all charges, meaning they were released and freed. Today, both Fannie Sellens' death and her passion for the welfare and rights of working people have been largely forgotten, but her name remains hallowed among Union people in Western Pennsylvania, and her spirit lives on whenever someone stands up for the American ideals of equality and justice for all. Fannie Sellens was buried at Union Cemetery, Arnold, Pennsylvania. The United Mine Workers raised a gravestone memorial to Sellens in 1920. All right, we're going to pause there for today.